Here are 15 ways Tim Cook saved Apple. People tend to forget that Steve Jobs was not the main person behind Apple's massive growth. It was actually Tim Cook. When he arrived in 1998, that's where the story begins. Before that, Tim Cook was brought into Apple by Steve Jobs because he was a logistics and supply chain guru. Simply put, he was at Compact, he was at Intelligent, he was a very smart dude, and now he was going to bring his logistical magic, his numbers magic to Apple. So the first way that Tim Cook saved Apple was he brought his logistical process of just-in-time production for the launch of the iMac. And this was basically a way to reduce stock in a warehouse, and it saves a lot of money in rent and in parts. Basically, you're not wasting time or energy or money overstocking products or having products out of stock and being late to customers. That's the first way Tim Cook saved Apple. And this was vital because in 1998, Steve Jobs needed to launch the iMac, and it needed to be a success out of the gate. And just such a coincidence that Apple's resurgence not just started with Steve Jobs again, but also it started with Tim Cook. So next, Tim Cook brought in his just-in-time production process. And basically what he did was he shut down warehouses. That's the main thing. He brought everything to scale more quickly, more compact, more tightly. And right away, from the jump, it made the iMac successful. So the second thing he did was shut down warehouses, along with bringing his years of logistics with just-in-time production. Tim Cook also perfected forecasting of sales. Now, Tim Cook thinks about how things are going to sell, what's going to sell, how many are going to sell, all those number crunching. He kind of is a magician of predicting, and this goes and helps the bottom line of Apple. It just makes everything seems like magic. Whatever Apple outputs, it's going to fly off the shelves and, not have any extra units or anything like that. So it's kind of like magic that now Apple could, not like in the past where they have a bunch of products that aren't selling. Tim Cook is helping Apple just push through things that sell. So now that Tim Cook is at Apple, making all those logistical dreams come true for Steve Jobs, Steve Jobs can focus on being the innovator. He does not have to run the company from top to bottom because of running a successful business. Although you need to be the innovator and create good products, you also have to have a great system in place to get your products and innovations out the door in a timely and tight fashion. So now, since Tim Cook is in charge of that logistical background stuff, Steve Jobs could focus solely on innovating and creating products, quality products. So before Steve Jobs was the marketer and Steve Wozniak was the creator, well, now Steve Jobs is the creator and Tim Cook's job is kind of the marketer, logistical guy. Next, Tim Cook did something really great by convincing Steve Jobs that he needed to outsource Apple's production away from California. It was very expensive and time-consuming to get the production of Apple products in the U.S. By making the move to China, he basically just made it a lot cheaper by moving all that production to the ports and the factories in China. It avoided U.S. taxes, and they saved a lot of money by the lower paying wages in China. So that was a big, gigantic move that's still in effect today. one of the more crazier moves that Tim Cook did while he was at Apple came around 2005 when Steve Jobs was in the early stages of thinking of releasing an iPhone. And along with the iPod that had a physical spinning hard drive, Tim Cook made it possible to actually secure a contract with suppliers for flash storage. That was going to be the future. Flash storage wasn't such a hot item. It wasn't really available to suppliers readily, in quantity. So what Tim Cook thought was he secured contracts to buy millions and millions of flash storage units for use in future Apple products. So the iPod mini was kind of the first one to go away from spinning hard drives and use flash storage. And that also was the basis for all the millions of future iPhones to come using flash storage. And along with that, not only will that exclusive contract with these suppliers to supply Apple first, basically what it did was it stopped the growth of other companies from innovating their products. So basically Android and HP tablets, for example, they got the inferior flash storage products or supplies from Apple. So basically it was a two-edged sword. They got Apple got the best products, the best flash storage supplies, and the leftovers were given to the competitors. So that really fueled the growth of Apple and the success of its products in the future. So now it is 2007, and Tim Cook has been at Apple for around 9 years, and it finally set the stage with all this logistical expertise that he has implemented at Apple, all these moves he made. It finally came to the moment in 2007 with the iPhone launch, and it was a success. And Steve Jobs was the face of the company, but Tim Cook was the one that made it grow. And it showed ultimately with the success of the iPhone, and it set the stage for all future Apple products, because now Apple finally had a mass-produced popular device that brought in tons and tons of revenue. It finally is putting money in Apple's hands, and it makes it possible for all the future devices and just the explosive growth thanks to the iPhone. And that was in part mostly by Tim Cook's logistical magic powers. So as Steve Jobs fell ill and ultimately was taken away by cancer in 2011, he passed away, and he picked Tim Cook to be the new man in charge, the new CEO of Apple. And basically this set the stage for Tim Cook to finally be the main guy making the decisions. And also there was a lot of groundwork laid for him and timed perfectly for him to succeed. And by that I mean in 2011, 2010, the exclusive contract from AT&T to sell the iPhone kind of expired. And now, just as Tim Cook is stepping in, he is making negotiations to open up the portfolio of Apple products. And basically now Verizon, T-Mobile, and Sprint are now selling iPhones, and this creates a frenzy of money. It creates basically new users overnight. Millions and millions of people that were not on AT&T can finally have an iPhone, and that just opens up a floodgates of new iPhone enthusiasts, and it just brings in tons and tons of money. And I'm pretty sure that Tim Cook was involved in these negotiations to finally expand this old 2007 exclusivity of AT&T. This pretty much opens up the market in the US and abroad to sell Apple and make it the brand it is today. Around this time as well, Tim Cook saved Apple also by making some really tough decisions as a boss. And what he did also was he fired Steve Jobs' best friend, Craig Forstall. and he was the main guy behind the iOS software that runs on iPhones and iPads, and he fired him. And this was a tough decision. I mean, Craig Forstall was fired basically because he released Apple Maps, and Apple Maps had a lot of bugs. And there was feuding between him, Craig Forstall, and Tim Cook, and within Apple executives as well. They didn't really like Craig Forstall. This was kind of Tim Cook saying out with the old, in with the new, and he kind of just made the decision to get rid of him. And that was pretty much a sign saying, we are not going to do what Steve Jobs would have done, but we're going to make it even better. So Tim Cook, by firing Forstall, is basically saying we are moving forward. We're turning a new leaf. And basically, we're moving on. We're creating beyond Steve Jobs. The next move he did after getting rid of Forstall was he put Johnny Ive in charge of iOS development. So now he created iOS 7, and that was the big change, a refreshing change of iOS software. And this was the clear indication of moving out with the old and moving in with the fresh new coat of paint. And this made the executives at Apple a lot more collaborative, and it gave Johnny Ive now complete control over not just hardware but software. So now the beauty of Apple products are in sync with the software, because now Johnny Ive is the one that could actually have full freedom to create software with the products, and it's just harmony. So now Forstall is fired, Johnny Ive is in charge of software, and the rest of Forstall's jobs and duties were spread out among all the other executives, like Craig Federighi, just to name at least one person familiar with Apple. Eddie Q was in charge of other stuff. So basically now, as a boss, Tim Cook is delegating different jobs and duties to other high-ranking officials, and it's kind of cool because Tim Cook made a tough decision, and he's getting away from Steve Jobs and moving forward, but also he's keeping the same people in charge and giving them more say in product demonstrations and product decisions. It's like Tim Cook made the perfect move of celebrating, past success, but moving on and focusing also on what's going to keep this company going forward. So now we move on to 2014, and this is a pivotal moment with Tim Cook and products itself. And obviously, Apple as a company is already dominating with the success of the iPhones, but there's still trickles of remnants of Steve Jobs in his iPhone soul. The iPhone did upgrade in size from just a small 4-inch screen. It went up to a couple of more half an inch, pretty much got a little bit bigger with the 5 and the 5S. But as soon as the 5S was done, the iPhone 6 is where Tim Cook opened up another floodgate of sales for Apple, because he finally made the choice for people to get a bigger iPhone 6 and an even bigger 5.5-inch 6 Plus. This is pretty much really getting away from Steve Jobs' old company values of being small-minded and having no choice at all. Tim Cook is finally seeing how Apple could explode in profits by offering different choices. And at the time, phablets from Samsung and other Android manufacturers are growing in popularity. So now Apple is making that choice easy. Now people could actually, before if they wanted a choice, Apple was not for them, but now Apple is offering that choice, and it's dominating the industry in so many ways. So now Tim Cook is offering different sized iPhones at different price points. different models, different colors. It is just exploding. Apple is finally catering to every single person, not just the iPhone enthusiast. Now everybody is invited to the party. And in turn, they're giving their money to Apple in droves. There's almost no excuse not to use an iPhone at this point. And they're releasing so many different iPhones at different price points and sizes that it's easy to find a product for you from Apple. And it doesn't stop there. Tim Cook sees the future, and he knows that there's limitations on physical hardware improvements. The iPhone has steadily improved under Tim Cook's watch at this point, but he knows that there's only so many changes you can make on a yearly basis that it's going to slow down eventually, and people are going to know that Apple is not innovating anymore radically from year to year on the iPhone and iPads and Macs and all that stuff. So what does Tim Cook do that is just vital to the success of Apple for its future is he starts also releasing services for Apple. So now they're getting away from the hardware game and focusing a lot of effort and energy into services. And he started doing this most notably with Apple Pay on the iPhone 6. So now you can use your phone to pay for stuff. He also has paid services being released, such as Apple Music, Apple TV Plus for TV and movies. The Apple Card will soon follow. Savings account, Apple Fitness, Apple News, Apple Arcade. He even releases Apple One bundle. So now Tim Cook is really hitting his stride, his bread and butter of Apple, where not only are they pushing, Apple is pushing its bread and butter of products and hardware, but also he's getting revenue from services. And these are very low cost, bottom line type of numbers. There's they're not really spending any money. They didn't really create anything new from hardware, but they're just kind of making a new market for income for Apple with these services. It's very genius of Tim Cook. And although Tim Cook now sees the future as not just hardware, but software, but he doesn't want to stop there. He's still continuing to see what is going to move the needle. And he knows that year over year updates on its hardware is not going to fly for very long. He knows that services is undoubtedly pushing more and more revenue into Apple's hands. It's great, but he's keeps pushing forward. He's given his team the power. He trusts his team. Tim Cook is not the in-your-face micromanager that Steve Jobs was, but Tim Cook is a great delegator. He is pushing what sells. He's forecasting what's going to sell, and he knows that Apple, as long as they just keep pushing forward in the right way with his logistical prowess, they could have a lot of inventory of stuff, but just get it out the door. And that just makes it easy for him to be like, hey, everybody, let's start focusing on new products in general to keep stockholders happy. And these products, we're only going to release them if they sell. And it includes Tim Cook's first true only release product has pretty much really nothing to do with Steve Jobs. And that was the 2015 launch of the Apple Watch. And it is followed by the AirPods, the HomePod, the AirTag, and finally the Vision Pro. And then along the way, the pandemic happened in 2020. And what did that do? Instead of making the company go down when everybody else was hunkered down at home, it made Apple even more money because now Tim Cook has all these products, all these services. People are in love with their tech, using tech every day. It just fueled even more popularity for Apple products and services. So now when we think of Tim Cook, I honestly believe that it wasn't just Steve Jobs that made Apple successful in 1998. It would not have been possible without Tim Cook. And I believe that Tim Cook is the reason that Apple is the company it is today, more so than Steve Jobs. I believe that if Steve Jobs didn't get sick and he continued to run Apple instead of just Tim Cook, I think a lot of people would not would they wouldn't stand his demeanor and his ideas. They felt kind of stagnant. He was a true innovator, but after a while, people will kind of get tired of your micromanaged style and your way of not letting things grow on their own organically. And that's what Tim Cook was good at. He was a great boss. He was a great ambassador. Those are the things that Steve Jobs wasn't good at. Tim Cook knew what the market was like. Steve Jobs was a great innovator and knew what people liked, but Tim Cook knew what people liked and what was gonna sell and what the company needed for the future. And one of the best ways that Tim Cook saved Apple was he agreed with what Steve Jobs said on his dying days, when Steve Jobs told Tim Cook to follow his intuition as the new CEO of Apple. And Tim Cook decided and took Steve's advice on running the company, not how Steve Jobs would run the company, but what Tim Cook would do himself. And Tim Cook obviously made the best impression on the company, and it was probably the best thing for Apple. Was Steve Jobs was booted off of Apple once, and Apple burned down, and he came back. He probably would build it up again like he did, but without Tim Cook, he probably would have failed again, and Apple wouldn't exist today as the great company as it is. So people should really give Tim Cook a lot more credit, and also not just focus on Steve Jobs. Tim Cook really is probably the best boss in history if you think about how he made Apple the biggest, richest company in history. So let me know your opinions. Thank you very much.